So one of the things that I've heard about in terms of diversity when it comes to Gen X and millennials in particular is that for Gen Xers, they saw America become more diverse. I mean, just look at that difference between early boomers and Generation X. It's already an 8% difference. So diversity is something they accept as a part of their American experience. In contrast, millennials were born into a more diverse America, so they not only accept it, but they celebrate this diversity. Now, going from acceptance to celebration, I can't even imagine the words that would be used for Generation Z, but I imagine they'd be even more exuberant about that diversity because it's something that they just experience as a part of their American life. Looking at education, jobs, and debt, I think as we're talking about younger generations, it's really, really important to keep in mind education and educational debt. We have to be talking about this topic. I'll often tell people if you're going to talk about educational debt, or rather if you're going to talk about finances, you have to talk about educational debt with these folks. You can't be talking about giving and generosity and asking millennials to give unless you're also recognizing that this type of debt from student loans and otherwise is a part of their experience. Now, this of course applies to Generation X as well as Gen Z too. And we'll talk more about that in just a sec. But first, let's begin by looking at education. Probably comes as no surprise that millennials are better educated than prior generations. And I would guess that Gen Zers are actually going to beat us on that and become even more educated by percentage than the generations prior. However, just because you are more educated, as you see here, kind of moving along the line in terms of bachelor degree and that light green on the bottom, does not mean that you necessarily are entering a job where you have that degree. Oftentimes this is a misnomer. People assume if you have more education, that automatically means that you have more wealth, but that's not necessarily the case. 36.7% of recent grads are working at jobs that do not require a degree. Now, thinking about this context that we're in right now in particular, I'm curious. I have not seen the data yet, but I'd love to know what happened with recent college grads this year in terms of how they have been able to enter the workforce, because I'm guessing it might even be a larger percentage than what you're seeing there. Taking a look at student loan debt, this article that I'm mentioning here, Millennials, Ball and Chain Student Loan Debt, is an old article, but I really appreciate the metaphor that Hadley Malcolm uses there. Ball and chain, ball and chain. So when you think about student loan debt, I encourage you to think about that as a ball and chain that someone is dragging behind them. Taking a look at the data here, the approximate amount of outstanding student loan debt is $1.56 trillion. The average outstanding balance for a borrower with debt is around $32,000. And borrowers with more than $20,000 in debt, in student loan debt, is 1 in 2. And the numbers of people with $50,000 in debt and more is just rising. 2018 graduates who graduated with student loan debt were 7 in 10. So most people are graduating with debt. You're seeing the amount of debt that they're carrying. And oftentimes, because folks know I'm interested in math, and Jim is too, people will ask me, Grace, doesn't this just go in line with inflation? I understand, everybody has some student loan debt that's raising over time as our economy grows, but this is not lining up with inflation. Let's just look at the numbers here for a minute. The average outstanding balance is now around $34,000. So this data is a little old, but you're seeing how this is going. It's up 62% over the last 10 years. In addition, the borrowers who owe $50,000 or more has tripled over the same period. Student loan debt is an enormous issue. Student loan debt, I understand, affects people of all generations. There are folks even in the silent and the greatest generation that are taking on debt for family members and friends. I understand that. I did have someone debate with me a few years ago whether or not baby boomers were taking on more of the brunt of the debt than millennials, and I'm sorry, I just can't go there. It's important to remember that all generations experience this debt, but those who experience it most egregiously tend to be millennials, Gen Zers, and Gen Xers. So let's take a look at technology and social media. Just so you understand, when I'm thinking about social media, there's a variety of different social media platforms out there. Likely there are some on this list that you know, and maybe some that you don't recognize. The most widely used platform among US adults across all generations is YouTube at 73%. And I would argue, I don't have the data to back this up, but just from anecdotal experience, I'm guessing the amount of people using YouTube has gone up in the midst of the pandemic, especially because some churches are using YouTube to go live for their church services. Similarly with Facebook, it's following right after at 69%. That's also, I'm guessing, will have gone up during the pandemic because many churches are using Facebook Live or Facebook video to be able to showcase those church services. You'll notice there's a big gap. You have YouTube, you have Facebook, and then we go all the way down to Instagram, followed by Pinterest, and all the way down the list. But when you think about those primary social media platforms, I encourage you to think about Facebook and YouTube. Now, looking across the generations, I often think it's funny when you talk to people in the millennial or Gen Z generations, they'll often say that they're not on Facebook and Facebook's too old school. But as you see here, across the board, people from all generations seem to be on Facebook, and that's the one that has the highest usership. Looking at YouTube, that has a very high usership among a younger generation and lower among those 65 plus. But again, I'm guessing that might have gone up in the midst of the pandemic. For other primary social media pieces, you'll notice they do vary by generation in terms of usage. But again, I encourage you to focus on YouTube and Facebook. Oftentimes when I talk to churches about their social media presence, they kind of balk at me a bit and say, well, we don't have a lot of young people. But I constantly remind them that people of all generations are using social media, whether it's YouTube, Facebook, or otherwise. In fact, my grandmother, who is 91 years old, uses Facebook all the time. She comments on every single photo, so you always know grandma has seen it, and she's very engaged. She loves this way of being able to connect with family and friends. So next, let's talk about religion. Oftentimes, millennials are known as the none generation, or the generation that does not have a specific religious affiliation. And oftentimes that's talked about as if it's a new trend, as if millennials are the first to have that less affiliation. But as we look across the board, according to this Barna study, this is something that's been growing over time. In the top box, there are those kind of like the light orange. That's the Christian non-Catholic. That's the group we would tend to fall into as Lutherans. We see that number going down over time with kind of Gen Z, millennials, and Gen X around the same levels. Elders at 51%. Boomers at 48, Gen X and millennials and Gen Z around kind of the low 40 percentages. Looking at none of these, that's kind of hovering around the same level-ish for most generations. So again, this is not something new. This is something that's been growing over time. Now, what's interesting is as religious identity may be fading in some ways, looking at studies in terms of spirituality, there's a lot of places where the generations have a lot in common. Those who feel a sense of spiritual peace and well-being, you'll notice that does go down by generation. So greatest experience that the most, millennials experience that the least. But feeling a sense of wonder about the universe, across the board, pretty similar. Feeling a sense of gratitude and thankfulness, again, pretty similar. And feeling a sense of meaning and purpose in the life is pretty similar. So while I might often think that along religious boundaries we are very different, when it comes to more general spiritual concepts, especially concepts that a lot of which we hold to as Christians, the generations are not all that different. So those were just some demographic trends, which can help us to all get on the same base level, especially because I know some of you don't know any millennials, others of you have millennials in your life, maybe your kids are millennials, you have millennial nieces and nephews, whatever that might be, but this gets us all on the same level. Now I'd like to share with you a bit about my research. As I mentioned before we broke for lunch, this is the research I did out of that project where I was finding people didn't really want to engage with me around this topic. So I decided to go out and talk to as many adults under 40 who were in faith communities as I could find. Note, this is not a diverse venture. It was out of the back of my car, so to speak, so I was just going to as many congregations as I could within the mileage that I was permitted by Luther Seminary. And I got to talk with churches mostly from urban and suburban settings, not very many rural. That being said, I think a lot of this data can be extrapolated to fit a variety of different contexts. I ended up talking to 8 different congregations, a couple of focus groups, a couple of interviews with 65 people total. And here are some of the things that I learned. One of the biggest learnings that I had, and this kind of surprised me, is that younger adults are looking for a space for conversation. They want to talk about money, finances, giving, generosity. In fact, they were eager to talk about it. After one interview in particular, a couple of the folks came up to me afterwards and said, "Grace, we are so glad you're here. It was such a great conversation." And while this may not make immediate sense to you guys coming out of your own context in Northern Great Lakes, we have something we like to call Minnesota nice, where people say the right thing to you, but often it's in a passive aggressive way. And I kind of thought that these folks were doing that. They were saying, "Oh, thank you for coming, Grace, but really honestly, we wish we were at home doing something different rather than listening to a researcher all evening and answering their questions." So I said, "Okay, thanks, that's great, thank you for coming." And they said, "No, you don't get it. This is the first time that we have had a conversation about money and generosity where no one asked us for money at our church. This is the first time where we had a conversation about money, giving, and generosity where no one asked us for money." How often in your context do you have conversations about money without asking people for money at the same time? I asked them, "What does stewardship mean to you?" And they had a couple of different views for me. For over half of participants, they said that it didn't resonate with them at all, or it had a negative connotation. I love the way 120's research participant put it. "The word stewardship does not mean anything to me, and I bristle at it. It is a veneer on this thing of we want your money. There are positive meanings of the word, but it feels like a con word." Now, I've talked with people of all generations about stewardship, and I would guess that this finding, that half of participants either don't resonate with it at all or have a negative connotation, is probably not generationally specific. I'm sure Jim could tell you plenty of stories too about how people bristle at that word stewardship, and I'm guessing almost all of you, if not all of you in the room, have had a similar experience in your congregation. When it comes to positive meanings of the word, one of the things that came up most often is the word care. And I believe, Giselle, you were the one who mentioned this earlier. Taking care of people or places was a common definition that people were pointing to. Also, folks tended to align with the idea of environmental stewardship. That was the context in which they had heard that word before. As far as stewardship associations go, I looked through my whole list of my interviews with folks to see how they associated with the word stewardship. What were the words around it? Community, faith, and mission tended to be the most common stewardship associations. Now you notice the traditional Christian language, God, Spirit, Jesus, even Christian itself, were not necessarily associated with stewardship, but community, faith, and mission were often associated there. Looking at motivations for giving, they had a variety of different motivations for giving up time to the church and for giving money to the church. So let's look at those separately. Looking at motivations for giving time, serving their congregational community was the highest reason that these folks really appreciated giving up their time. They also loved being asked, and not just being asked through a bulletin insert or a blanket email, but being asked specifically to use their gifts. And I think that goes across generations in terms of how people want to be engaged. They appreciated that their time was used effectively and efficiently. There was a story that was told by someone in my research project of a couple that had moved into a Presbyterian church recently. They were excited to join, and one of their first Sundays that they were there and really starting to get invested, someone invited them to be confirmation leaders. They thought it was a great opportunity to continue their investment in the community, so they said yes. However, they found out during their first confirmation meeting that this was a 3-year commitment. No one had told them before that point, and you can guess that these folks were a little bit gun-shy about volunteering again when they didn't have those parameters in mind. I'm guessing the leaders of that confirmation group didn't not tell that couple on purpose. It was just something they thought was part of the culture. Oh, well, everyone knows it's a 3-year commitment. Everybody knows that stewardship committee meets on Wednesday nights. So when they sign up for stewardship committee, they know that's a part of the role. Remember, it's important to outline these things for folks because not everybody is going to know that. The things that kind of demotivated them from giving up time were schedule, time commitment, as I just shared, and then for some of those folks who had families with children, childcare was a big piece of this. Kind of an aside to this, but if you're looking to diversify your stewardship team, if you have one in your congregation, oftentimes people say we're having to kind of change up our structure, because if we're wanting to include families with children or younger folks who have a different type of schedule, it can be really challenging. Now, this doesn't necessarily apply in COVID times, but bear in mind for the future that one of the best ways I have heard of people engaging younger folks on their stewardship teams is to have their meetings either before or after worship. Usually then childcare is available for those that need it, and they're already at the church. They're not having to make a separate trip. The other thing that I would suggest too is a task force model. This is the way that I led my stewardship team at my congregation when I was in seminary. I invited people for specific reasons to join me for specific projects. So they didn't feel like they were taking on board a 2-year or 3-year commitment. It gave them the ability to use their gifts when it was needed and then step back and decide if they wanted to join again. Looking at motivations for giving money, the mission of the congregation was on the top. They believed in that mission, they wanted to invest in it. Transparency was incredibly important to them. They wanted to know how the congregation was doing financially and where the money was going. They also wanted to know that their money was making a difference. I know this is something we've continually brought up, but it's very, very important to folks. They wanted to support the church that had been there for them and brought them in and cultivated them in community. And then for one specific member, asking to increase their gift was high up on their list. This woman had gotten a letter from her congregation and she didn't get much mail, so she was pretty excited about this. And in that letter, the congregation had asked her to increase her gift by 10%. And they had done the math for her. She'd been giving $90 a month. They said, would you consider increasing your gift by $9 to give $99? She said, oh, $9, I can of course spend that. That's more than I'd spend on a dinner out. I can easily do that. Let's make it $100 and send it back. I cannot encourage you enough, as someone who has studied math, most people don't know how to do simple math. So if you ask them to give 5% more, 1% more, 10% more, a lot of people aren't going to be able to do that in their heads. I mean, think about how many people you know who have to use the calculator on their phone just to calculate their tip at a dinner table. Bear that in mind as you're asking people to increase gifts. If you do the math for them, they're going to be more likely to join in the effort. Living paycheck to paycheck, especially for the younger folks I interviewed, was something that was really hard on them and kind of demotivated their giving just because they weren't sure how much money they were going to need from to month. Life uncertainty was a big piece of this. I did these interviews shortly after the recession, so a lot of people still felt a little bit uneasy and uncertain about their job situations. Competition from other nonprofits outside of the church did come up on occasion, but honestly didn't come up as much as I expected it to. But the biggest thing was money being used inefficiently. If you're using money in inefficient ways, or if there's some secrecy around the money in your congregation and you're not being transparent about where that money is going, these younger folks are going to be some of the first to pull that money away. Because again, they are motivated by the cause, not by the institution. So if that money is not going towards that cause and they don't feel like they can trust you, they're going to find another cause where they can give that money and feel like their money is making a real difference. So let's take a look at money talk. Money was not talked about much in congregations except for giving appeals or the annual budget conversations that would be had. So I want you to think about, when was the last time you talked about money outside of those times? When's the last time your pastor brought up money during a sermon that wasn't related to a giving appeal? Only participants from one congregation mentioned that their congregation discussed the way they use money in all of their life. This is a congregation called Jacob's Well in Minneapolis. And this pastor does more topical sermons, so he doesn't necessarily follow the lectionary. And he takes those topics from whatever his congregation asks him to talk about. So he'll often go around and say, what should I preach about? What kind of topics are important to you? And he said the 2 topics he hears about most of all are interreligious dialogue and money. And even after he's already done a money series, sermon series, his congregation will say, again, we need more conversation around money. They really thrive off of hearing those money conversations. There was a desire across all the folks that I talked with for more discussion about personal finance and particularly around how to use credit cards well. They had some questions related to giving. The first is how much is appropriate to give? How much is appropriate to give? I love this quote. It has been hard for us because we never knew how much was normal. $5 or $500? Our parents didn't talk about it. When's the last time you talked about what's appropriate to give? Now, there are a couple different ways you can do this. One of the things I often suggest to people is that you open up the giving conversation during any new member classes or new member discussions that you have, and talk about what people generally give. Give people a place to start and invite them to grow from there. Also, if you're going to use the word tithe, some churches do, some churches don't, make sure you're defining what that means within your context. The other thing I would say is I've seen a couple different ways of people to do this where they invite leadership to talk about their giving. So for instance, in a congregation I know that has a pastor who is a late baby boomer, an associate pastor who's a Gen Xer, and an intern who's a millennial, they have talked about giving in the range of appeals. So for instance, after a recent hurricane, the baby boomer pastor got up and said, my family and I are going to give $1,000 for the hurricane. I hope you'll join us. Then the associate pastor said, my family and I are going to give $500 and we hope you'll join us. And then the millennial, who is also a seminary intern, stood up and said, we're going to give $100 and I hope you join us. So it's one way to illustrate the variety of different gifts that are out there and also help people to see themselves within the leadership and gauge where they might fall on that list. Another thing is pledging. The word pledging really felt daunting to the folks that I was talking to. They said, pledging is daunting, it's a commitment. I fear not being able to pay, so I underestimate my giving. In contrast, one of the other members that I talked with through my research project, she had served on the council in her congregation. She was pledging, she was giving, she was excited about it. She filled out her pledge card for the year. And shortly after that, she lost her job. Now, she really valued this commitment she had made to the church, but she realized pretty quickly she wasn't going to be able to make it happen in the same way she could before when she had this job. So she called up the church secretary and said, oh, I made this pledge, but now I can't make it happen. And she's in tears, really frustrated, wanting to tell this church secretary that she wasn't going to be able to make it. And the secretary had no idea what to do with her. She never received a call like this before. I often discourage people from using the word pledge. Obviously, take it for your own context. If it works there, it works there. Estimate of giving, I find, is a little bit better. And helping people understand that we know things are going to change. I mean, honestly, if 2020 has taught us anything, it's that things are going to shift and change financially and otherwise. So being able to help people understand that as finances are better in your life, you might give more to the church. If something happens detrimentally to you financially, you might need to give less, and that's okay. We as a community are joining together, knowing that those who have more will be able to step up to the plate to fill in the gaps for those who aren't able to do as much. So the last thing that I want to share with you is a few ideas that work. Now, these are going to be pretty general, because I think context matters. There's no quick fix, there's no best practice that you can pick up here and run with. You really have to figure out what works best in context. One of the things I often encourage people to do is have conversations about money where there is not an ask attached to it. And one of the best ways we can do that is talk about ways to align our money with our values, or our money with our lives of faith. Because believe it or not, you can live out your faith through the way you are spending money, the way you're saving money, and not just through the way you're giving money. In fact, you can also live out your life with money in the way you're acquiring it. How does a person of faith acquire money? How does that money come into their life? These are important conversations to have, and honestly, the gospel readings lead us right there. That's what Jesus is talking about all the time. So we shouldn't escape those readings, but dig deeper into them and not just use them as an excuse to ask more people for money. The next conversation I encourage you to have, which it sounds like many of you might be having already if it fits for your context, is to think about online giving. As you'll notice, across the generations, online giving is something that's growing there, as is crowdfunding. How might you use those in your context to bring in gifts in an entirely different way? Another thing to think about is telling stories that help people see the impact of their giving. People want to know that their giving makes a difference. People want to be able to see what's going on with the money that they're giving. And particularly in the midst of the pandemic, when the only time you may be interacting with your congregation members is through a video that they're seeing on Sunday morning, people are going to want to hear the stories of how ministry is still happening, even with the current restraints that we are under. Next, you might consider offering a personal financial wellness resource, something that helps people think about their life with money. Now, there are a variety of different ones out there. I don't tend to suggest specific ones, but one you might think about is one you may not have heard about before, which is called 6 Weeks on Money. It's by someone named Tim Schuster, who used to work at Thrivent. And what Tim does that I think is really helpful is he starts by helping people consider the relationship between their money and their values and their life of faith, and then goes into the tenets like budgeting and saving and debt reduction from there. So it's about a framework of who you are and then how that impacts your finances, rather than assuming all financial tenets fit all people. I really do encourage you, if you have this available to you. I know, Ralph, you mentioned you don't necessarily have any millennials around. So this may not apply, but if you can seek out generational diversity on your stewardship team, please do it. And when you do so, bear in mind that you shouldn't be just trying to replace someone who's left. So let's say Meryl, who's been on the stewardship team for 15 years, is leaving, and she's always the one who counted the offering. Don't assume that this person you bring in is going to immediately fill Meryl's shoes. In fact, they may have other gifts and strengths that they want to bring to the table. They may also have a lot of questions about why you're doing things the way you're doing them. Don't only listen to those questions, but really engage them and dig deeper and see what you can learn from these folks. Don't just expect them to be another cog in the stewardship wheel, so to speak. Last but not least, focus on financial transparency and efficiency. I think particularly this year in the midst of the pandemic is a great year to be really honest about where your money is going. Line item budgets can help you do this, but I have to be honest, I'm someone who likes line item budgets and I do read through them, but I think I'm one of the 10% of church members that would really do that. Find other ways to tell the story. And we'll talk about that in the Proclaiming Why section in just a few minutes. Oftentimes people will say to me, they'll come up after this workshop and say, Grace, this is so exciting. I really want to engage more millennials. What do you think a millennial in my congregation would think about this or that or this? I always encourage them, why not ask the people who are already in your seats at your congregation? Every millennial, every Gen Xer, every person is different. I can't answer for them. So here are my research questions I used in my research project. These can be used with people of any generation, but I encourage you, as you're trying to learn more about the people you're serving, these might be some helpful questions to use. You're certainly welcome to use them and access them. So now we can move into discussion questions, but I'm guessing there might be some questions in the chat. All right, so it looks like we do have a couple questions in the chat. And maybe we'll go into those first before we go into the other discussion questions. So the first question is, Jim, are you recording this? It looks like it is recording, so I think you're good. Yeah, some churches are offering financial classes and counseling. Are there any ones that you found that have worked particularly well that you guys have heard about, financial classes or counseling, or how they've handled those?
We've had some congregations in our synod do the Dave Ramsey Financial Peace University. I have not individually, or like any quote canned program, there are pros and cons to it.
Exactly.
But indeed, the whole concept of doing financial thinking. So very quickly, as a pastor, new members classes, I would talk about financial stewardship, and we would talk about, I would show them our church's spending plan, and I ended up creating graphs and spreadsheets on the power of the commitment, if you want, estimate of giving. People tend to honor their commitments as best they can, and then I would introduce percentage giving. And you know, if something bad happens, a turn in your income flow, think percentage rather than that net amount. What else was I going to say? Yeah, and then in pre-marriage counseling, I would spend probably an hour and a half on money in pre-marriage counseling.
Where I see an opportunity for that isn't necessarily in the congregations, but on college campuses, because there's so many people that they don't know about budgeting, they don't know how to read a balance sheet, they don't know the difference between an asset and whatever, but they don't want to take accounting, but just to encourage them to see the, I don't want to say consequences, the impact of their choices, both short-term and long-term. And maybe all they need is an encouragement. They've got people going, oh, we've got these, for instance, I see a lot of college students walking their dogs. And it's like, man, when I was in college, I could barely feed myself. Sometimes I was just living on popcorn, but because they have those credit cards, they're like, okay, we're going to Starbucks every day and we're going to have a dog to feed. But just to help them know that, yeah, it's hard to say no when the animal shelter is like, we need homes for these fur babies, but it's something to maybe realize that it's okay. It's not selfish to put that off for a while. I just think that if we could have some offerings in our campus ministries, that would be something that would certainly be ecumenical and beyond.
Oh, I certainly agree with you, Giselle. Yeah, absolutely. It's something we do quite a bit with at the Stewardship Leaders Program at Luther. We're not a college campus, but we are a graduate school, and that's something we have tried to do. I think something important to think about, Giselle, is do you really know that those students have dogs themselves, or are they walking dogs because they are using that to make money? Because one of the best ways for younger folks to make money is through apps that are kind of Uber-esque, but for dogs, where you can actually get paid to walk and take care of someone's dog. So just bear that in mind as you're looking at them, that honestly, I have not met any college students who have dogs. I'm sure they exist, but just something to keep in mind with kind of the assumptions, again, that we're placing on people when we see them like that. And also, while some students do get into credit card debt in college, just again, credit card debt tends to wage across the generations and actually tends to be older than younger in terms of debt numbers. But I'd love to know if there are any other questions people have out there before we start discussing. Anything else in the presentation in particular?
What was the word you used, Grace, instead of pledge?
That is estimate of giving. There's a couple different ways to do it, but estimate of giving is one I found works in a lot of places.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, so I would love to hear, if you're willing to share, how have you seen generational giving dynamics play out in your congregation? Is that something you've seen?
To be honest, the first time I heard about it was today. And I think I've learned so much about millennials because I think as baby boomers, we tended to have our preconceived notions of what they were. And I've learned today that I should never do that. And that I need to look at things in new eyes, to look at it differently.
I would say, as a general statement, our churches lack imagination when it comes to engaging stewardship with younger adults. I mean, we kind of do a little something in Sunday school, I think, but of course, Sunday school is being a diminished reality. But I had the memory in Sunday school, you were given offering envelopes. I think some churches still do that for children, but to what extent do we follow up with our college age youth when they go off to college? I just think there's a wealth of opportunities that we just haven't explored, and the default position can be, well, we don't have any. Yeah, so we need to go beyond that.
I was thinking that possibly, and I remember doing this with children, much like Jim was saying with the envelope thing, but they had their own mission that they had inside the mission of the church. And their giving was designated to support like a child in Central America or something like that. So they had this real sense of that what they were doing was doing something for the good of the world. And perhaps even in some way, their way of sharing the gospel with someone they have no contact with. They would exchange letters, but that was about it. And we found that to be very positive with the kids. And then I think they've taken that, well, again, limited experience, I guess, but I think they take that with them that into their adulthood, and as they get involved in other churches, that, as you pointed out here, that it's a lot has to do with the sense of mission and the transparency of it all, being able to see that the money is being used efficiently and effectively.
I want to
Grace,
ask
when you were
I want to ask a question about our time in COVID, where we're not seeing our people. You know, we're doing our services over the radio, it's printed, it goes out on video, but we don't have the connection with our members. If we have 15 that come to the church, that's a large number now that we've opened up. How do you suggest we go about connecting with people when we don't see them? We get 150 people who watch our videos on Sundays, but we don't know who they are. And how do we reach to them to help them support what we're doing and find out who these people are?
That's a great question, Catherine. As far as finding out who they are, while I have no doubt that Google could help you sniff that out a bit in terms of demographics, I probably am not equipped to go into that. But I would encourage you to make sure that stewardship is something that you're including as a part of that service that they're watching. There's a couple different ways that you could do that if you're not already doing it. One, I would encourage you to use that offering time, whether you still have that included in the service or not, to tell a story of how you're making an impact. I think, Catherine, you were the one who shared earlier of how you're really trying to make sure you guys are staying connected with people during this time. You know, do folks know that story, that your leadership team is doing that? Because I think that's incredible. I think that's incredible and very inspiring. The other thing you might do also, though, is putting kind of a slide on the beginning or end of that video so that people understand the ways that they can give to the congregation, and maybe a word of why it's important, connecting it in with that mission and what you guys are doing with that. Even just something like a PowerPoint slide is pretty easy to stick on at the beginning or end of a video, depending on how you're doing it. You may also use language around the page. I don't know how you're producing and sharing the video, so it's hard to give specific suggestions, but those are some of the things I would suggest.
Yeah, it's interesting in this time. We have gone from using a personal cell phone to post parts of this, just the sermon online, to now we are doing about 2/3 of the service. And we have purchased a camera and all the cords and things that go with it. Thank you to the Synod for having a grant we can apply for. And it hooks into our sound system, and it's pretty incredible. So we are starting with some of the slides. And I just want to say, if somebody wants to know how to find what they need, the camera and the wires for under $500, if they would call Faith in Sault Ste. Marie, we can give them a list of the things they need to purchase.
Love that. That's beautiful. Thank you, Catherine. And what a cool way to illustrate the value of the Synod as well. I'm just thinking in that story of how the Synod was a huge part of allowing you guys to continue to do your ministry. I mean, that's a mission support story right there in my mind.
Yeah, indeed. One of the coolest things we've done on the Synod-wide level, we had to cancel our May Synod Assembly. It was going to be at Finlandia, our church affiliated school. We had to cancel it. So the bishop had an inspiration to grab people from all over the synod, create a video, online video worship. So it became a YouTube format. And I was charged with creating the offering portion of it. So it's that intentional ask and showing a QR code for those of you see those funky little squares with looks like a Rorschach ink test. Showing you could take your smartphone, put it up to your screen, and go to the website. List the website, list the synod address. So I think all of our congregations need to think of their online worship not just as a time of meditation, but it's a worship, and part of the act of worship is we give to God. And so don't be shy in your online offerings to have that time of offering. And if anyone wants help or suggestions on that, I'll be glad to help you. But yeah, keep asking.
Absolutely. It's great.
Grace, one of the places I've seen giving over the years and through the in this area anyway, are the quilting groups. It's just amazing how many quilts have been made, and it's an opportunity of not just giving your time and your talent, but of coming together. And my daughter is an amazing seamstress. She's really into sewing, and so she's made baby quilts and she's made Mardi Gras dresses and all that stuff. But if she were to go to a quilting group, there wouldn't be too many there her age. So do you see anything when you were working out of the back of your car talking to these people where there could be something similar to that maybe would be more, this is only because of the lack of a better word, modern?
Well, and I think too, the intergenerational stuff can be really fun as long as it doesn't feel exclusive. The congregation I attended in seminary, the demographics there were really bizarre, but it was mostly people in their 90s and people in their 20s. And it did not make any sense, but that was the way it was. And it was lovely because the people in their 20s never felt excluded. The church history was talked about and shared as kind of a gift we were all stewarding together, but it wasn't talked about in such a way that you felt left out if you weren't there back 80 years ago when X, Y, and Z happened. And we just had a blast together. So I wonder if it's less about finding a different type of activity, although that might still be true, and more about making sure we're creating an environment where newcomers are welcome to bring in their own ideas to shape the offering into something new or something a little bit different, so people don't feel left out of a group that's been together for 30 years. Oh, Ralph, I think you might be talking. You're still mute.
Okay, I'm on. Thank you. Just two comments. One, with regard to a stewardship of time, what I believe is happening, at least in our congregation, is that you can't just put a thing in the bulletin and ask for help. The pastor just can't, make an announcement and ask for assistance with regard to whatever activity it might be. I think, the response is nil to none. And, but I think if you go to individuals, and I think you have to be, you have to give it some thought as to who you're going to ask, so that you don't just ask the same people who have said yes in the past. But if you ask them personally, I think you'll find that people respond. And I don't know if that's something generational or not, but it seems that's what's going on in our congregation. The other comment I would have is that talking about money, I think, has to start at the very top with the pastor. And I would hope and trust that the seminaries are getting better at teaching and encouraging and confronting pastors that are going into the parish with the fact that one, they have to be good stewards themselves, but also they can't be afraid to talk about it.
100% agree with you, Ralph. Luther has a long history of doing that work, and it is hard work, and we still have a lot of growth area there, but it's something I'm really committed to and eager to work with, because I think our students more than ever are beginning to realize this is something they can't escape, but many of them don't have the tools in their toolbox to do it. So it's really exciting to work with them. But to be honest with you, Ralph, my courses I teach, which are all money related, are not required. There are lots of courses that are required, and that one is not. And while I hope someday during my tenure at Luther, there will be one required course on money, I can only ask for one to start with, right? I don't know when that's going to happen. So I'm 110% with you, Ralph. I just think we have to make this a focus,